This is a quick video on the latest update, full profitability for Jet. Just wanted to show you a few things. So there is a new monitoring tool, Jet Monitor Status. It takes a second to load. So basically what it does, it shows the status, active or paused, for all of your rebalances, right, with all of the peers. So for example, all of my outbound, so these are outbound peers and these are balance peers. So that's kind of when the rebalancing is really meaningful, right? So for all of the peers, it says, okay, well, the rebalancing is active with, okay, that's the current local ppm on that peer, and that's the current remote ppm. So then it says, okay, based on the current local and remote, I set the maximum ppm for my rebalancing at 575. So one thing to keep in mind is that currently the enforced profitability, which is a new config setting, is off, which means that by default, when you upgrade to this release, Jet will preserve the current behavior, which it's not going to enforce profitability on rebalances. And that's where something you can see right now is that it takes the local ppm as the max ppm, thus overriding the current max ppm default in the config file, which is set to 500. And in addition to that, it says, okay, well, the best range, or kind of the recommended range, or the minimum range, I would say, for the local ppm on this peer is 464 sats to 644. Right, so with the current one, which is 575, we are sort of closer to the middle. And since we are not at the like upper range of this range, Jet says, okay, consider increasing local ppm within the suggested range. So it basically says this, look, if you increase the local ppm within the suggested range, you're gonna increase the chance for Jet to rebalance with this peer. Because when it comes to rebalancing, right, it really depends on your local ppm, right, when you want to do it profitably, as to whether your rebalancing is going to be profitable. So it's kind of really pros and cons. Like the higher value you set, the higher is the likelihood of the rebalancing to succeed. But then again, the lower, you kind of really lower your chances for other peers, for forwards, to come through your node and being sent to this peer, right? So if I jack up this local ppm, then I technically lower, or I may lower, my chances to get forwards, right, sent through this outbound peer. So and the same thing for other peers. Okay, so one thing I wanted to know, so override, right? So as I mentioned, the current setting, the config setting, which is enforced profitability, is off. What this means is that Jet overrides, or Jet can override the max ppm that would be set otherwise if there was profitability enforced. Because when profitability is enforced, we never go above the local ppm. But since profitability is not enforced, Jet says, okay, well, I've got a little bit more leverage, and I'm going to increase this to 499. So the reason that it's 499 is that it looks for sufficient buffer, which is currently set at 200 sats, between the remote site fee and the local fee. So the reason being is because the remote fee is basically is the minimum you're going to pay for rebalancing into the peer, right? So when I rebalance into Mark, the remote fee is 298 sats. A remote fee, when I say remote fee, it's actually remote ppm. Then that's the minimum I'm going to pay. But it's not just going to be Mark's node. In the router, there's going to be other nodes. So that's why Jet says, okay, well, let's leave a bit of a buffer, which is currently at 200 sats. And that's the reason you see the 499. Now, if the enable profitability setting was set to true, then it would have taken 375, essentially keeping the profitability in check, but at the same time, the chance for this rebalancing to go through would be lower. Okay, let's go down the list. So these nodes, you don't see any nodes, any range, meaning that everything is looking good. So the same here is that it did the override. So basically, instead of setting it to 175, it set it to 325. Okay, and what's interesting is for this peer, for Bcash. So remember I mentioned that Jet actually takes into account how frequent your peer updates the fees, and if they do it too frequently, then it basically is not going to recommend changing fees because your peer may be flip-flopping. So then Jet says this, okay, peer changed, it noticed that peer changed fees 4 times over the past 24 hours, and the minimum fee was 2 sats, right? So since the minimum fee was 2 sats, then, there is a likelihood that the peer is going to change fees back to 2, and they actually did, and you don't need to change your local. So it's kind of doing it in a smart way. Okay, so we go to the rebalance status for balance peers. So really, when you think about all of your peers, right, it's Jet splits it into 2 groups based on the current routing, outbound and balanced. You kind of really want to optimize for the outbound peers because that's where you're making most of your sats. But then at the same time, you can also make sure that rebalancing does happen to your balance peers. And again, so you see here it recommends to increase the local ppm within the range. So we are at 675. So the buffer between remote and local isn't that sufficient. But basically the rebalancing can still go through. Again, it says that, okay, it overrode the max ppm since it kind of really tries to increase the chance for rebalancing to go through. And since the enforced profitability is off, so if enforced profitability config setting was on, it wouldn't be doing any override. So just FYI. Okay, etc. and other peers. So there's one other thing I wanted to show you. Like, let's say you want to deep dive and kind of really understand what's going on with a particular peer, right? So what you can do is you can go to Jet analyze fees and say for Java, so basically the first peer. You can either do it just a portion of the name, as long as it's unique. It can be uniquely reserved to peer, or it can be their pub ID. So the idea is that Jet Analyze Fees is sort of this lower level debugging tool, right? It can tell you a bit more details about what's going on. Okay, so it says, okay, here are the current fees. The maximum ppm is set to 500. It's not being enforced. So it sets the optimal max ppm to 575, right? Because that's the local fee. And then it says, okay, well, insufficient buffer between optimal max and remote ppm, and the rebalances have less of a chance to go through. So it kind of really explains you what happens with this particular peer, right? Even though rebalances are on, like as you can see here, but rebalances have less of a chance to go through because 575 is sort of in the middle of this range. So we can take another peer, for example, let's take Mark and do the same, Jet analyze So again, it kind of really gives more details, right? As you see this in a table, you're like, okay, what's actually going on? So you can do Jet analyze fees and like, okay, great. So current fees, so it sets the optimal max ppm. Why is it optimal? Well, because it's the local ppm for profitability is going to be optimal. And then it says, okay, there is an insufficient buffer between optimal max and remote ppm. Why there is an insufficient buffer? Well, because the buffer is, so if you look at the difference between 375 and 298, it's 77 sats, That's less than 200, which is kind of current recommended minimum. And then it says this, okay, since the enable profitability setting is off, then it's going to override this optimal max with 499. So with this table, you kind of get a high level overview across your peers. And with this tool, you kind of really get into more of a lower level details. So that's sort of the end of this video. I'm going to record another video later on how to do like other optimization using Jet's tools. And yeah, cool. Cheers.